This podcast is brought to you by AgRecruiting Staff, the UK's leading forestry and land-based recruitment consultancy. Visit their website at www.agrecruiting.co.uk. Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Tree Talk podcast with me, Katy Davis. Today I am joined by Barbara Bonfim, PhD. Barbara, you're joining us from Brazil today, am I correct?
Yes.
Fantastic. Can you tell me a little bit about your main area of work and what you specialise in?
Of course. Thanks so much for inviting me, Katy. So I'm a forest engineer and I have been working in tropical woody ecosystems for 13 years. So a bit, my family comes from self-sustaining farming, actually, living in harmony with the savanna where I'm from. Central Brazil is basically the Brazilian savanna. Mm-hmm. So my family comes from planting, raising cattle and conserving the native vegetation, right? So that's, kind of like the natural way of living from people, 100 years ago. But I grew up during a time of rapid transformation of the landscape in central Brazil, when the native vegetation was being fastly replaced by large cattle farms and soybean plantations. And that's why I decided to study those native ecosystems to be able to translate their value to others who never really bothered to stop and understand them. Mm-hmm. So basically my professional trajectory includes forest inventory, ecology, conservation, forest management, and most recently, soil biogeochemistry in forests and a lot of data analysis too, right? So most of the work that I've mentioned has been through extension, right? Working with landowners, managers of conservation units, and also research projects. So I think I would say that I've specialized in generating and analyzing data to tell stories of how those complex forested and woody systems function and how we can better manage them in face of chronic climate change.
Wow, fantastic. So where has your research taken you? So I understand that you've done quite a lot of traveling. I saw on some previous webinars that you've done and some information online that you've done an extensive amount of traveling with your research. So where's your research taken you?
Yeah, so thankfully lots of places. So in Brazil, I've traveled from north to south, east to west to collect data, right, and samples. And in California, where I spent almost 9 years, I also traveled all over because I was studying soils, and the way to study soils is traveling and digging soil pits.
Of course.
So we traveled all over California, and I also explored a large portion of the Pacific Northwest in the US when I was a postdoc in Oregon. But besides my work in forests and soils, I also spent almost 2 decades traveling to compete in adventure racing, which is a strange team sport. And I've been to the UK to compete.
Oh, have you?
Those races. Yeah. So that took me to many countries. And it was another way to explore ecosystems that, I couldn't see in Brazil, for example, or in California or other places where I've been to just for research. So I've been to alpine ecosystems in French Alps, to rainforests in coastal New Zealand, grasslands in Wales, drylands drylands in northern Argentina, and freezing mountains in Patagonia.
Oh, wow.
And I have paddled in Loch Ness and climbed Ben Nevis.
But you have. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So do you think that the attitude towards forest management and sustainable forest management is kind of pretty universal, or is it really different from kind of one country to another?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it's different. For example, I remember biking in Spain in an area where they were logging trees, right? So, I was biking on trails that passed through timberland that was being managed. Yeah. And you don't see that happen in Brazil. Usually, for example, private areas that are used for tree plantations in Brazil, they're closed. Like you can't just I'm biking here, and then the same in the Amazon, where management is focused on native forests, right? So I think in Brazil could learn a lot from multiple use of forests that I have seen in other countries. because that's a way to provide income. For example, you could charge, small bucks for people to access the land when logging is not happening, for example.
Yeah.
Right? There are tons of trails and tracks in those areas.
Yeah.
So I think that varies a lot. And of course, because of legislation, right, different countries have a different history, different culture related to forestry, right? So
in terms of obviously the logging situation in if we maybe focus on Brazil, is it governmental or is it all private companies that are partaking in the logging and really benefiting from it?
So we have private lands and public lands under management. So private lands, basically, you still have to follow the legislation, and legislation in Brazil is federal. For example, differently from the US, where, law in California is different from law in Texas and, in other states. In Brazil, it's federal. So, you can purchase land and, start managing forests once you have the approval from the environmental agency, right? You need to put a plan together to show what you're going to do, how your management is going to happen. And companies can also bid on concessions to do management on public lands.
Okay.
And this is something that is a bit controversial when we're talking about what's controversial. Because the ambition is to expand a lot, right? So, but some of those public lands are also close to indigenous lands or to traditional population lands. So the logging also impacts areas that are nearby. Right. So that's why expanding just like without the input from these neighbors, right, is not as, nice. And that's what has been happening, but I agree that expanding plans that are known to be sustainable, it's a good idea to prevent illegal deforestation and to prevent conversion to monocropping systems, which is usually what happens on land that is not claimed by anyone.
Yeah. Well, within the UK, obviously the logging situation is very heavily, it's very heavily regulated, and obviously that that makes for a really good situation. In terms of, obviously you mentioned the illegal logging there. What is the reason that is not kind of managed very well? Is there a particular reason? Is it money? Is it, what's the situation there?
Yes. So Brazil is gigantic, right? It's a continental scale country. So we have a good monitoring system through satellites, imagery, etc. But it takes time for action to take place. So it's fairly easy for people to go in and remove logs illegally because they make a lot of cash.
Yeah.
So there is a market for illegal logs, right? So people remove those trees illegally and they have basically free cash, right? Because they didn't pay for any of that, right? And then so that is profitable to many, right? That also is kind of easy cash and fast cash for locals. But, it has been proven that those criminal organizations are rather based on cities where, people actually are the heads of the organization. Okay. So it's unfair to say that illegal logging happens only based on like local or regional, organizations, not at all. So there is it's a bit of many things. So one, the government can't be everywhere. In Brazil, like, for example, I'm a forester, and imagine I want to work for the government in an environmental agency. Your career progression is awful. You usually don't get well paid. You don't have a great career progression. So it's not appealing for people to work in the environment, right? It's something like, oh, you work in the environment? It's kind of like, oh, what a loser. Oh, wow. So instead of being like, of course you work in the environment because you're in Brazil, you're in a heavily forested country, country that hosts so much in natural resources. So there is an agenda of like letting the environment just degrade, right? And on the other hand, we have lots of socioeconomic issues, right? So many times these, rural areas where forests are, there's not much, there are not many opportunities for like
Yeah.
jobs for people,
Yeah.
so if you come to the area and say, hey, if you log 20 trees for me, I'll give you $2,000,
Oh,
in,
wow.
in 5 days. People are like,
Yeah.
of course, I don't make
Yeah.
this money, in other job or something.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of everything.
Yeah, it's really quite heartbreaking, really, isn't it? If you consider it, because there are so many people that it must be so tempting, particularly as you say, if there's no other opportunities. It must be a really difficult decision for them to take that money and to kind of partake in that. How does it affect? Obviously, you touched on the local people. How does it affect the people that live on the boundaries of those forests? I mean, does it have a really big impact on their life and their finances as well?
Yeah, so a recent report like done by a nonprofit organization showed how much the land in areas where deforestation happens, and I mean illegal deforestation, how much the land is worth less money than it used to be,
Yeah.
based on the like a 10-year period that they have analyzed. So basically people with less resources, they're more impacted than those with more resources, right?
Yeah.
And then, so I think a lot of that we've touched, in your previous question, has a lot to do with culture too. In
Okay.
Brazil, we have a history of colonization and prejudice, right?
Yeah.
So people who identify themselves with the forest, they end up being people who are not as wealthy, or people who are, in a high society.
Yeah.
So many times there's a lot of denial, right? People who live in the forest, they're like, they want to get rid of the forest because they see the forest as the reason for lack of progress, lack of
Oh, wow.
development, lack of job opportunities, education, etc. So it's something very deep, and it's
Yeah.
not, yeah.
It's so essentially, I suppose their thought process is, by clearing some of the land and creating opportunities for farming, it then provides, just obviously using farming as arbitrary, that it provides them with a sustainable income. So they're essentially seeing that as a barrier, aren't they? They're seeing that ecosystem as a huge barrier. That's
Yes, yes. The unfortunate truth is that the conversion of forest to ag land does not provide income opportunities for people, because usually those lands are converted to big farms that don't employ many people.
wow.
I
Okay.
have, I have many family members who are cattle farmers. And I
Hmm.
have to say, you don't need to hire too many people, like basically one person per 1,000 hectares.
Wow.
you know so it's
Yes.
not like you're providing jobs. You're not, it's the fast cash, it's the fast return. They
Yeah.
only think about the $2,000 or 2,000 Brazilian money that they're going to make that week, right? They don't think of the long term because
Yeah.
they can't.
Yeah, I mean, how can you, when you're kind of struggling and you can't, essentially, you've seen no other option than to take that money, and that
Yeah.
must be really, really do, and I get it, it must be really, really tough. I mean, we're always within the UK, there are always documentaries on, yes, to say, for instance, the Amazon rainforest, and there's always discussions about it, and it's always put either to two things with us. It's either farming or palm oil, and we never touch on the socio and economic plight of the people that are within. And that, obviously, having this conversation with you, and I think it really does highlight how much effect it does have on the local people. And we're always talking about, carbon, and talking about, all these issues from deforestation. One thing that, from kind of my research and my reading, that we don't talk about enough is diseases, and
Mm-hmm.
how, the loss of a lot of the Amazon rainforest is causing a huge amount of diseases to spread really, really quickly. Things like malaria through mosquitoes and things like that. And I was reading that there were some statistics to show that, the percentage is just increasing and increasing year on year, and the more Amazon is destroyed. Why do you think that that's not a top priority for people to talk about? Because it really affects people's livelihoods and people's lives. So why are we not being shown it? Obviously, we unless we Google it, or we have a look online and research it, it's not put out there for us to really understand. So what are your thoughts on why that's happening?
Yeah, no, I agree with you that, there are studies linking deforestation with malaria, for example.
Yeah.
And it's not my expertise, but I know that it affects the cycle of the mosquito that spreads malaria. First, I want to touch again on what I mentioned about prejudice and the social, kind of like panorama of Brazil. Malaria happens mostly in the northern Brazil, where there are not as many people as in other regions in Brazil, like the southeast, where São Paulo is, which is the
Yeah.
richest, state in Brazil. So everything that affects people who are not as wealthy, people care less about, unfortunately, and that's
Yeah.
one of the reasons. For example, people care a lot about COVID because it affected everybody, right? But
Absolutely.
think
Yeah.
about diseases that affect only people in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
People care a lot less about, so who is affected by the disease makes a difference in how this disease is,
Yeah.
treated. And so, I've been quite a few times to the Amazon, and people there, usually say, oh, I've got malaria 5 times, 6 times, 7 times, 8 times, right? So it's something that Brazil does a good job in treating. So you
Yeah.
can find treatment anywhere, and that's free.
Mm-hmm. Oh wow.
But
Okay.
we don't have like a vaccine, for example, to prevent. And I was a bit kind of shocked to know that in the US, there is a medicine that people can take to
Yeah.
avoid getting malaria. But we don't
Mm-hmm.
have this here where we have malaria,
Yeah.
so this kind of mismatch between, different worlds, right?
Yeah.
Where,
Absolutely.
money exists for this kind of, thing. And then, kind of going back to this study, and I found that it was very interesting because the study showed that, a 10% increase in deforestation leads to over 3% increase in malaria incidence. But they
Wow.
also found that an increase in malaria resulted in a decrease in forest land cleared. So they found that there is a bidirectional socio-ecological feedback. And that reveals again that when we try to study the Amazon and try to, find remedy for all the issues we have in the Amazon, we can't
Mm-hmm.
forget the socio-economic component, right? The social
I agree.
component, for
Yeah.
example.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because we are like directly connected, human health
It's the
and environmental
fundamental
change.
part.
Yes.
Yeah, and it just blows my mind that we just don't talk about it. We often talk about the Amazon rainforest and deforestation and how terrible it is and how awful it is, but when we start asking questions, well, why is it happening and how is it affecting people, it's very much, well, you don't need to know about that, you just need to know that it's really bad, and that's kind of it. And it's, but if you do your research, it's actually it's quite interesting to see how it really really does affect people. And as you say, it's just it's horrible, isn't it? It's really is quite devastating for that, large parts of the country.
Yeah, to me, it's not a matter of how many people die of malaria, it's who dies. If we
Yeah,
start getting people who are more in the high society dying of malaria, be sure we're going to have a vaccine soon.
it's sad, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's I suppose it's just reality, isn't it? And it's how it is at the moment. I mean, are there big pushes within the government to kind of to create vaccines, or kind of bring in
I,
vaccines? And
I don't know because we have multiple problems now. It's hard to choose which
yeah,
one you're going to tackle.
yeah, well, of course,
Um,
especially with COVID,
Yeah,
being
and I think because Brazil has a good job in does a good job in treating malaria, I think it's more like, well, we can't entirely prevent except for like avoiding mosquito time, right? So when we do field work in the Amazon, we never go into the forest early in the morning, and we never stay until like late because that's mosquito time. So that's one way to
yeah,
avoid, getting bit. Another thing is using nets, right? When you sleep, if you're sleeping in a
yes,
hammock, using net. So there is a way for you to try not to get malaria. And then
yeah,
if you get malaria, you have fast and free treatment. So I think in one way, Brazil is like, okay, this is kind of under control,
yeah,
but we have problems now with hunger, right? People are hungry.
yeah,
So that's something that is like maybe a top priority, should be at
of
least.
course, yeah, of course. So you spoke about nutrient cycling and soil biodiversity in a recent paper that I read. What is the importance of understanding those factors within tropical forestry, and how can it, support other countries, and how can it provide other countries with kind of that sort of, that sort of knowledge, and for us to use best practices on?
Of course. So a bit of like a small story just to get to the point. So
Yeah.
tropical forests are self-sustaining systems, right? So
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about tropical forest management in the Amazon, we're talking about the management of natural forests, right? So they're able to cycle their nutrients naturally. Okay,
Yeah.
so to maintain productivity, and tropical forests are the ecosystem that most sequester carbon on, across all terrestrial biomes. So they need to be efficient in nutrient cycling because they usually occur on old, highly weathered, nutrient poor soils, right?
Yeah.
So when we talk about the cycling of nutrients in a forest, we talk about, the fluxes of nutrients from the soil to the tree, back to the soil, and also the action that happens below ground that we don't
Yeah.
get to see. So it is extremely important for us to understand how, for example, logging operations impacts changes in nutrient budgets in forests under
Mm-hmm.
management because of long-term impact, right?
Yeah.
And then, when trees are logged, we have to understand that we have some exploitation of nutrients, right? Because all those nutrients on the stem, they're removed
Yeah.
from the system. And one of
Yeah.
the best practices is to leave the leaves, right? The canopy on the forest floor, because
Of
that's one
course.
way for you to maintain those nutrients
Cycling.
there.
Yeah.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
some studies have shown like that one of the consequences of management can be negative nutrient budgets for certain timberland areas, where, for example, in many areas in the Amazon, where you don't have too much provision of nutrients like phosphorus because those
Mm-hmm.
soils are very old and highly
Yeah.
weathered. So the tiny amount of phosphorus that is there is tightly cycled, and
Yeah.
so that's why it's so important to keep the cutting intensity low and the harvest cycle long, right? To try and make sure that, maybe the fungi are going to be able to supply some of this extra phosphorus that, growing trees are going to need. We have
Yeah.
more and more influence of external phosphorus, for example, because we know that we don't have too much input from the atmosphere of phosphorus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Differently than nitrogen. Most of the nitrogen is in the atmosphere, right? We are
Yeah.
breathing now 78% of nitrogen, but
Yeah.
phosphorus now is rock derived. So we don't have, but because of forest fires, I have to say a lot more dust, right? And particulate matter that is burned, right? It circles around. So I did find some study, for instance, in Africa,
Mm-hmm.
quantifying the influence of phosphorus that moves from one burned area to another area that wasn't burned. So there's a lot of action kind of going. I mean, it's a hot topic of research, right? We don't have all the
Yeah.
answers, but basically the story is this: you don't want to mess up the cycling of nutrients in tropical
Yeah.
forests. And that's why when
Yeah.
you go in to harvest trees, you need to make sure that it's a low intensity, right? And it's selective in that you try not to remove only the same species, right? Because those
Mm-hmm.
species play roles that we don't fully understand. Science
Yeah. Of
has
course.
not figured out exactly why there's so many trees over there. I mean, as far as species, right? Diversity. We don't know
Mm-hmm.
the exact rule of each of those species, so this is a hot
Yeah.
topic in research. And then,
Yeah. I can imagine.
yeah, and then touching on soil biodiversity, we don't have as much research, I have to say, on logged forests in the Amazon. But
Mm-hmm.
basically, environmental changes, like the changes that you can, anticipate when you have logging operations, they change the abundance and the composition of soil organisms. And these soil organisms, they are very important in the flow of carbon and energy in those
Yes. Of course.
forests. So because of tropical forests, as I mentioned in the Amazon, are rely on natural forest regrowth, we need to make sure that the integrity of the ecosystem continues. And these organisms in the soil are fundamental components in nutrient cycling, right? They break down this plant material and make sure they're small enough for all the tiny organisms to come in and decompose them. So there's a lot more research in conversion of forests to other land uses, like pastures, for example. Then there are studies trying to see, okay, is this logging scheme A versus B better for soil organisms, for example? So this is very wide open, I would say, for research.
And what sort of, you mentioned kind of fungi, how much of a role does that play within the Amazon rainforest? Because it's a really interesting topic for me, and even here within the UK, I just find it absolutely fascinating, you know, how it's such an unknown subject and we don't talk about it enough. It just, in my opinion, you know, how big of a role does it play within the Amazon?
Well, that's a great question, and one that I'm definitely not the best person to answer. But I would say that, you know, every fungi that is able to provide these extra nutrients that plants need to grow, especially when they're under stress conditions, they will play a key role. I know, for example, that some fungi are very sensitive to moisture. So I would anticipate that logging that opens area, like too much of an area, right? And it dries out the litter layer on the forest floor. It can impact the survival of those fungi that are able to translocate phosphorus from point A to point B, right? Fungi are crazy and they're so amazing. And I'm also a big fan of them, but it's not something that I have, like, for example, focused a lot of my own research on. So I kind of miss on the...
No, it's brilliant. You know, it's something that really intrigues me. And I think, you know, from listening to somebody from kind of a different kind of country to ours, and it's it's so fascinating how things are in some respects are so different and yet so similar. You know, the fundamental basics are really the same. You touched on kind of forest fires, and I know that from what you've said in the past that there is an increase, and you said that when you were growing up, it wasn't something that you discussed and it wasn't something that you were taught about as a child, and yet, you know, now it's on the increase. And so what are your thoughts on kind of what's causing that, and kind of what, you know, how far do we go and what can we do to kind of resolve those issues?
Yeah, no, that's a great topic, and one that definitely, when I was a child, I don't remember seeing that on TV. Like, for example, forest fires in the Amazon, like I don't remember that. But now it's something that you see year after year. So Amazon fires, they indicate changes in environmental governance, in altered environmental conditions that we're seeing with climate change, and also lie at the interface of not only climate and land use changes. Right. So climate and land use change and management are the dominant stressors in tropical environments like the Amazon. So, you know, when you analyze the spatial temporal patterns of fires, for example, in the Amazon, it's very important to understand the social environmental systems. And I see that this is something that many scientists in the global north fail. For example, I was looking at a paper recently that was kind of like a reply to another paper saying, hey, these authors are trying to simulate fire in the Amazon only based on climate, only based on the biophysics of the plants and etc. And if you don't consider land use, for example, fire is still used by small farmers, you know, to let the kind of to kill the grass and then release some of those nutrients. And then when the grass is growing, the cattle goes and, you know, eats it, right? So these fires, they can escape, especially if they use fire during the dry season, which happens. So these escape fires are many times the trigger of larger fires. When you have rain, you have dry conditions, etc. So when you have more fragmentation, like we mentioned deforestation earlier here, you have more edge effect. So this forest, instead of being super wet, because a wet forest, really, you can try to burn it, it won't burn, right? Because it's wet.
Yeah, of course.
But when it's dry, and it happens that it's dry, it is drier when it has more of an edge, right? So then fires are more successful in advancing into the forest. So this, it's important to understand that Amazon forests, they did not evolve with fire. I'm from the savanna. The savanna has been burning frequently for thousands of years. So when you walk around the savanna, most trees, if not all trees, have very thin bark, right? So the thickness of the bark is a very important trait indicating how adapted a species is to fire. So when you walk into the Amazon, you don't find trees with thin bark or with thick bark, right? They're usually very thin. So that shows that, over, thousands of years, I don't know how many, they have not been adapted to that disturbance, right? It's not something that they have evolved with. So the human component is bringing this new disturbance into a system that did not evolve with it, right? So it's not like they can tomorrow have, seedlings growing with thick bark, right? So it takes time until, new trees are going to adapt, to this disturbance. And that's what is very, very concerning. It is massive in that it can destroy very large areas very easily. Even more than humans coming in and logging trees, I would say. So the cause,
but again, it's it's not something that's highlighted. We see a very singular kind of topic, and it's very much repeated, and as sad as it is, it's great to kind of get to the bare roots of what's really, really happening. So in terms of kind of the biggest threats to the Amazon forest, obviously we've talked about illegal logging. And obviously we touched on fires. Are there any other threats to the Amazon, and what are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, I think, I hate to say that humans are the threat, because, we are part of the environment. So every time we think of us as a threat and we try to separate us from nature, that's when the problem is, right? So but society today values more and more, capital, money, right? So we value having a lot of stuff. And this lot of stuff, usually comes to the detriment of the environment, which is called externalities, right? All those impacts that we don't pay for, right? When you buy something, you're not paying for the environmental impact of that stuff that you're buying. So, a bit of human greed, I would say, this desire for more and more and more and never ends. And a bit of culture. I think I touched a bit earlier, but I will expand in that. I think once, especially Brazilians realize that our wealth is in our natural resources, in that we are wealthy because we have 60% of the Amazon forest, people will change their mindset. So there's a bit of we are so much influenced by other countries that people tend to value more what other countries have, right? So people are like, well, they're happy and rich, so we want to have the stuff they have. But hey, they had other trajectory, right? Our trajectory is different. We can't just try to think that we're going to be just like other countries, exactly the same. We have a different story. We've come from a different place, and our trajectory can take us to a totally different place. But, this is, culture, it's just like the roots of a tree. Try to find the roots of a tree in a forest. It goes all over the place.
In terms of educating youngsters, do you see that there is a lot more education on preserving nature now compared to maybe 20 years ago? Is that something that schools and education environments are they introducing that? Are they pushing that and encouraging children? Because it's something that we do hear quite a lot, and I certainly have seen an increase in that over the last few years. So is it something that's kind of being taken there as well?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because that kind of reminds me when I told my parents that I was going to study forest engineering. They looked at me like, what? Did you say like medicine, or did you say like law school? They could not they could not possibly see any kind of job for me. They look at me like surprised, and that revealed the culture at the time, right? where
Of
people
course.
were at in environmental awareness at the time, when it was like early
Hmm.
2000s.
Yeah.
Today, people are like, wow, you understand forest and carbon, etc. There is money on that, etc. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
things changed a
Yeah.
lot. And I'm very, very optimistic in that, the new generation is coming very strong, being a lot more environmental aware of what's happening than when I was growing up. When I was
Yeah.
growing up, nobody talked about like recycling, about like not
Yeah.
wasting water, or
Yeah.
not burning the trees that you cut down from your backyard or whatever. These
Yeah.
days, those kids are talking about microplastic, nanoplastic. They're
Oh, wow,
recycling. They
really?
have
Yeah.
environmental projects at school. They visit nature a lot more than I did. We went to like malls,
Yeah.
etc. with school. If you told me when I was little we were going to like to a forest, I'm like, why? you know
Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah.
I think the new generation is going to do a much better job, than earlier generations. But, it's a
Yeah.
matter of time, as we
Of
need to be
course.
faster and faster in this awareness, because today the people making the decisions are those who grew up without any environmental education. So they
Yeah.
continue with the
Absolutely.
mindset of like, we have so much water, why would we care? We have so
Yeah.
many trees, why would we care about, so they
Yeah.
have this idea of like endless nature.
It's great to hear it though, because but you're right. We can't wait for that next generation of children and to become foresters or forest managers. Action needs to be taken now. So obviously within the forestry sector that you work, is there a large proportion of women that work within those sectors, or is it still quite a male dominated sector within Brazil?
That's a great question. So I serve in a nonprofit named Forest Women's Network, and in Brazil, in
Mhm.
Portuguese, we call it Rede
Okay.
Mulher Florestal. So that's basically the work
Mhm.
we do. We generate data that didn't exist before. So this question that you just made, there was no answer to it 3 years ago, right? People did not know
Oh wow. Okay.
how many women worked in forestry in Brazil. Like, so that's one of the reasons why the nonprofit started. And then so now we have 17% of the sector being female. And that's based on
Okay.
data that companies voluntarily provided, right? Many companies chose not to participate in the survey. So that represents
Okay.
the chunk of the sector that wants to see change, right? Because many people did
Yeah.
not even bother to answer the questionnaire about like, hey, how many women work in your organization, your company, etc.
Yeah.
So, the work we do is to try to open space for discussion, because right now women
Mhm.
are not preferred, for example, for new hires, because if you think of a new forest engineer, just
Mhm.
graduated,
Yeah.
and usually she would go to do more like field-based work. So
Yeah.
companies usually explain that they prefer not to hire women for those positions because it's male dominated and they are afraid for the health and the integrity. So that's one of the excuses
Okay.
that is used to really not hire women. And yeah,
Yeah.
so there is a lot of culture change that is needed. And, as we talked
Yeah. Of
about,
course.
culture is hard to change.
Yeah. Absolutely. And did you find it interesting? When you went and worked in America, you were in America for, was it eight
Yeah,
nine
almost
eight
9
nine
years. Yeah.
years? Yeah. Did you see that there was a big difference in more women working within those environments there? And was that a shock to you to kind of to work with lots of other women and to have that
Yes.
kind of solidarity with
Yes,
them?
I was shocked. I was like, because, usually in Brazil, everything I was doing, I was used to be like the only woman, very few women, etc. And when I was in California, especially because I was in California, right? Um, I was shocked to see so many women
Yeah.
in leading roles. For example, you
Yeah.
would go to a forest and you would see a woman leading a group of foresters, something that, in Brazil I had not seen before. usually women
Yeah.
were not the leads. They were maybe one or
Yeah.
two part of the team, but they're not like leading,
Yeah.
firefighters working with forest fires
Of
in,
course.
in
Yeah.
California. It took me a while to get used. And then, yeah, which reveals, that the culture that you're brought in, affects everybody, So I also grew up
Absolutely.
thinking that certain roles were more like male because that's what I saw all my life. And then when I went to
Yeah.
California, I was like, oh, never mind, that was a construction that, was in my brain because
Yeah.
of where I grew up and how I grew up. Right. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
think and that's why representation is so important, right? Because once we see ourselves in those positions, then we're like, oh, I can do that. Right. Why not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the UK, we have, women in forestry forums and women in ARB forums. And it's just, I mean, as a recruiter, it's just, especially working within the forestry sector, I just, I see such a mix and such a wide representation from both men and women. And I've never had anyone say, "Oh, because she's a woman," and I never get that. And maybe it's because, as you said, it's the culture, and maybe it's the companies that are employing, and they really want a wide range of people, but they're not looking at people because of their
Right.
sex. They're looking at people because, well, what can you bring to the
Yeah.
organization? I couldn't care less, whether you're male or female. It's ultimately about what can you bring to the organization. Are you passionate? Are you dedicated? Where can we fit you in? And that seems to be the main focus within the UK. And I do feel very lucky to live in that sort of environment. I mean, I'm not from a forestry background. I'm from an agricultural background, but coming into this sector, there was never any question of, oh, you're a woman, you can't work in this sector, you can't own a business. It was just, let's see what you can do. Let's see if you measure up, and if you measure up, then that's all well and good.
Yeah.
We briefly obviously touched on the fire side of things. And obviously, we know that in America, they have dedicated, correct me if I'm wrong here, so they have dedicated fire rangers and fire outfits for those particular forestry
Mm-hmm.
sectors. How does that differ to what you have in Brazil, or at least what you found in other countries?
Yeah, so, I was in California for 8 years. So I learned that, Western forests, at least, right, in the US, they're very much fire adapted. And that over the
Mm-hmm.
years, because of policy of fire suppression, for example, that impacted negatively those forests, right? So I learned that over the years, they
Mm-hmm.
were trying to reintroduce forests and try to mimic the history of different forests. For example,
Yeah.
some were more used to, low frequency, high intensity fires, and others the opposite, right? So there is a mix of like what kind of fire regime different forests have
Mm-hmm.
been adapted to. And then, so I've seen a lot of effort from the US Forest Service to try and do controlled burns, right? To try to thin the vegetation in those forests because they have become jungles, right? So 100 years of fire,
Yeah.
basically fire suppression, have completely transformed the
Yeah.
composition and the structure of those forests. And now it's not surprising that they have mega fires, right? That 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 also
Yeah.
compounded with climate change, right? Longer drought, so you have a lot
Yeah.
of,
Of course. Yeah.
anyway. So in Brazil, like, we don't have fire management in the Amazon, for example. But
Mm-hmm.
when you think about tree plantations in private areas, right? They have a lot of like lookouts for fires because, of course, they don't want,
Oh
yeah, they
wow.
don't want to
Okay.
lose their crops, right? So those trees are basically
Yeah. Well, of
crops.
course.
And then, so yes, so they do a
Yeah.
good job in preventing fires from happening because it's possible, as I mentioned, due to the management of farmlands that still use fire to
Yeah.
clear the land and release nutrients, etc. So there can be escape fires anywhere.
Of course.
So basically, like in
Mm-hmm.
the US, I've seen that fire has been something that they know that they need to reintroduce, and it's a bit
Yes.
unpopular because people don't
Yeah.
like to see smoke, right? nobody likes smoke. And then so
Yeah, of
because
course.
so many people now live in the forest or close to forests, and those control burns end up, affecting them, right? It's smoke that maybe they're
Yeah.
going to be, smelly, or they're going to be exposed to, and some people have health issues, etc.
Yeah.
So it's very polemic in California. They should do a lot more burning than they do because of the human component. It's not very popular, etc. And in Brazil, we have fire management more in the savanna, right? As far as like making sure that the fire regime, it's somewhat happening somewhat like the historical, fire regime. And then you have prevention of fires and tree plantations.
Yes.
Because those trees are not supposed to burn. They're gonna grow for like those eucalyptus are gonna grow for like 7 years, and they're gonna be harvested and then next in line. So other countries, I would say, like I was in Spain, but I don't remember seeing how they do the fire management there. But all those Mediterranean forests, I expected that they need to have some sort of fire management, because fire is a important component of Mediterranean, systems, etc. So I think it really depends on the climatic conditions where the forests are, to see, how fire is integrated with, logging and management, because it can be so beneficial and so important to the health and integrity of those systems. You just need to know how to do it and do it wisely.
So I noticed that in a previous paper that I'd read, that you argue that some of the issues with the current sustainable management of tropical forests can be addressed using carbon focused sustainable forest management to leverage the financial resources for the tropical forest. Can you tell me a little bit about your thought process on that? Because I know it's a topic that you're really keen to discuss. And obviously within the UK, we're also talking about. I think I said, we had that conversation, carbon credits within the UK, and it's a difficult topic at the moment. It's pretty controversial, but I'm keen to see your
Yeah,
thoughts
of
on it.
course. So, we know that voluntary carbon markets are increasing, and they will continue to increase regardless we like it or not, right? It's going to continue to increase.
Yeah.
So, and on the other hand, we have issues with the way forest management happens, at least in the Amazon nowadays, at least in Brazil. I don't want to pretend I know the legislation in other Amazonian countries, because I don't. So basically, the legislation in Brazil says that, a forest under a sustainable management plan can have a harvest cycle between 25 and 35 years. But we have decades of research showing that harvest cycles should be longer, much longer than that, because we have a different tree species growing those forests. So the way the legislation sets all the numbers that, those plants need to follow, like harvest cycle, cutting intensity, the kind of like timber annual growth, etc. It's all based on like single values. So it's not very species specific or site specific, remembering that not all soils in the Amazon are very poor. So there are differential growth rates just because of different soils. So basically, we have issues that can be solved because we have a lot of research indicating, where to go.
Yeah.
But because the legislation enables plans to be like, you can do research and then specify how your plan is going to go or not. You just follow the numbers that we give you here, which is like easier, So, if you think about, for example, I'm going to purchase 500,000 hectares of Amazonian land, and I want to do the right thing. So I need to invest in, gathering the data for me to decide what's best for that site based on the species that are there. So that takes money. Then that's where the voluntary carbon markets come in. All this finance is to enable solving those issues that would not be solved unless there is this extra money coming in, right? And then this additionality can happen because when you extend the harvest cycle, for example, I chose one easy way to fix, for example, the management. You extend the harvest cycle, so you allow the trees to grow longer. So all this extra growth, you can, quantify how much that reflects in carbon gain, and then you know how many carbon credits you can generate, and then you know the value. And then with this value, you can invest in changing, making the changes that you need, right? So there are methodologies for improved forest management, right? So all the pieces are there, but that's not actually happening yet, because I think people are still like, well, but we've been doing like this for a long time, so plans that are already in place, I don't think it's going to be so easy for them to make adjustments, even though they can generate credits and get cash for that. So I think that there is a lot of potential for new plans, for example, new land that is going to be purchased for management or like concession, right? So new companies coming in to manage public forests, if they come with like, hey, there is this management here without the carbon finance, but there is this other one here that you can get. You generate carbon credits because you're improving the management, and then you're showing that you're only doing that because you can generate carbon additionality and because you can get the finance. So that's basically, the main pieces that we touched on this commentary. Because the moment is now. It's a great moment to be doing that.
Absolutely.
And I think I want to share also my perspective being from the tropics. I see that carbon offsets are very polemic. I'm not here saying that, they're perfect. No, we know the issues. We know that many people are delaying action because they're like, we're offsetting our stuff and just continue our business as usual. But we have to remember that parts of the world are like hungry. Part of the world are like with massive need for, financial resources. And many times they're close to forests. They're close to places where carbon can be added to the system if, trees are planted or, management is improved or, there are many ways, right, to put together a carbon project. So that's how I see, the benefit of these voluntary carbon markets. If we're able to move, money around, that this money is going to ultimately come to people who don't, benefit from, the finance that is done, today, for example. So that's kind of like how I would, talk about this with a public that is like, oh, but this is, these offsets are like delaying climate action, etc. I'm like, on one hand, yes, but on the other hand, we're able to fix issues that, have been there for like decades and just won't change unless we have this, because people are moved by, financial incentives, of course. Every company wants to profit. If you come say, hey, you can get cash if you do that, they're like, okay, I might do it. Yeah.
Let's do it. Yeah. It is interesting. I mean, it just goes to show that there's not just one answer to kind of solving all these issues, and there's such a multidisciplinary answer, and there's so many factors that we need to consider before we can even do anything, and before we can start kind of resolving these really serious issues. So you're currently in Brazil at the moment. Are you going to be going back to doing any research? Because you work for some of the universities am I right, in America, doing some of the research
so
out
I
there?
am stationed in Brazil, but I am a postdoc researcher for Berkeley National Lab. And so Berkeley Lab has a research station, partnership with a research station in Manaus. And so that's why I'm here. I'm working in collaboration with master students who are going to start doing some field work and generating some new data. And then I'm going to be joining them, hopefully now in March. I'm really excited to go back to do field work. With the pandemic, a lot of the field component of the project I work in got paused. And that had a huge impact on the progress of the project. And so I'm in a like very, very exciting situation and position because I live both worlds. I am working with people in the US, but I am thinking of, Brazilian forests and how we can leverage their existence, to generate information for basic science, to generate information for applied science, to try to, connect practitioners with people who are generating information to, hey, these people need this information. You have this information. Can we kind of like join the dots? Yes.
Collaborate. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So are you kind of going to be moving? Are you going to be moving back to America for a short time, and then, or is it that you're permanently based in Brazil and just kind of going backwards and
So I'm gonna
forwards?
be here until at least early next year. And right now, I
Yeah,
am working closely with some colleagues on a project, kind of connecting the dots that I mentioned here throughout this,
yeah,
conversation, because I see that,
yeah,
a lot of the movement for like startups and funds, a lot of that comes from the global north, right? So we need to have people who live the
yeah,
reality of the tropics to think about, hey, we have this idea, for carbon, for the climate, for biodiversity, and for people. So that's what we are, putting
yeah,
together a way to be high, come talk to us because we have other ideas, we have other perspectives, and then we can improve projects that are being
yeah,
developed elsewhere. Because it's impossible for people who are in Switzerland understand the reality of Brazil, right? But many times it's
yeah,
in
yeah,
Switzerland that we have the resources for projects to be conducted here. So that's what we're trying to do, to bring people together and
yeah.
have
Of
a
course.
hub where people can just, the ones who want something and the others who can, yes, come
Come
together.
together and
Exactly.
yeah, absolutely. And do you ever collaborate with anybody within the UK at all? Is that something that you might be looking to do
Of
in the
course,
future?
like
Or
because research is so international, I have, many people in the UK in my project. They're actually based in the US, but they are from the UK, so
mhm,
they come from like UK perspective, education, etc. I know that there are some scientists that have done a bunch of work in Brazil who are now professors in the UK. So, and I have Brazilian colleagues who now work in the UK. So I think when it comes to like the science community, we're very international. So I'm always
yeah,
like hearing the perspectives from people who are there, but they do work in Brazil, so they
yeah,
they also know the reality here. So I, as a professional, I love working with people from everywhere. I learned so much, and I think it's the
yeah,
best way forward, right? I don't think we can solve complex
yeah. I
issues with
agree.
like a homogeneous group of people.
And we said that, didn't we? We said it's just amazing that we can bring people together and have conversations. And I think the forestry sector, particularly within the UK, we're so good at sharing information. And it would just be nice sometimes to share that information on an international level like that. That would be because, we may be able to support each other. It's not a country problem, is it? Climate change. It's
Yes.
it's a world problem, and everybody actually needs to work together. And actually, if we can collaborate and help each other,
Yes.
then fingers crossed, it might be able to start
Yes.
resolving some
That's what
issues.
I like to say when I give talks to students or to, broader audiences is like tropical forest serves everyone. They are doing
Yeah,
their job on regulating Earth's climate. So regardless where you are, you
mm,
have a stake on that. If tropical trees
yeah,
are
of
being
course.
cut down illegally, is a loss to everybody. Of course, some are more directly impacted because they're physically closer to that,
Hmm.
but we're all impacted.
Of
So,
course.
we all need to come forward and,
Yeah,
advocating for, positive change.
yeah, I agree. Barbara, thank you so much for your time this evening. I really, really
Thank you so
appreciate it.
much. I
Thank
had a
you.
lot of fun, chatting with you, and thanks so much again.